Welcome back to our little Scripture Saturday session, the fourth one of 2014. Remember last week we looked at the Gospel of Matthew, and I want just to look a little bit at the second Gospel traditionally, the Gospel according to Mark. It's traditionally assigned to someone called John Mark. It may have been written in Rome, perhaps gathering together many of the memories of St. Peter about Jesus before Peter himself had died. But the Gospels all had a long formation because it began as an oral tradition. The stories were told, just as we tell stories nowadays. Not everything's written down. We hear things in our families about ancestors and holidays and so on that are not written down. So whoever wrote this Gospel may have taken stories that were associated with Peter and with John Mark and added other things to it, perhaps from other written sources. But there was something about this Mark character that was at the centre of that tradition, which ended up being the Gospel of Mark as we know it. There's a tradition going back really to the early church of assigning to each of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, an animal. And here we have a picture from one of our churches, St. Patrick's Church at Murlog, Clonlee Parish, just on the outskirts of Lifford, where you have Matthew is a man, a human being. On the top right then you have Mark, who is always seen as the lion. Below then you have Luke, who's seen as an ox, and John, who's seen as an eagle. So our symbol is Mark, and St. Mark's in Venice, all of it, but Venice is associated with Mark, and you see the symbol of the lion very much. So how did we get from the events in the life of Jesus to a written document? And I suppose there's one way of looking at any passage that may help us to understand that. First of all, you look at a miracle or a parable or some event or some saying of Jesus. One question you can say is, or ask is, what was Jesus trying to say whenever he mentioned that? Look at what the context was. What point was he responding to? What was the message he was sending out? The second thing, of all the stories that were told about Jesus, why did the early church remember X stories particularly well? And you find things like the Transfiguration and the temptations and so on of Jesus appear across the Gospels. Why were some stories, the ones you're reading, why were some stories seen as very significant and others forgotten? And then finally, when it comes to Mark's Gospel, why did Mark, in the story that he was telling, put this particular saying or this miracle or this teaching of Jesus in this particular place? So there's always a way of seeing how there's layers of meaning in any of the stories. The meaning for Jesus, the meaning for the early church, and the specific meaning for Mark. So some of the characteristics then of Mark's Gospel. It's the shortest by far of all the four Gospels. And it's just about the public life of Jesus. It begins with Jesus the adult, just shortly before his baptism by John the Baptist. Nothing about childhood, whatever. And little about the resurrection either at the end. It's really about the public life of Jesus. And in many ways it's a blunt, simple gospel. For example, there's one place where it says that Jesus' relatives came along. They wanted to take him away because they thought he was mad. And it's a blunt story as well, because Jesus faces rejection early on. And then he gets to Jerusalem after he leaves Galilee and rejection there. Gets to Jerusalem and meets more rejection. So this gospel that will have been written down eventually some decades after the death of Jesus, and yet has been told and has been gathering meaning and so on right down through the decades. The message that's there is that despite all the tale of failure, Jesus is the Lord. In other words, the opening verse, and I'll read it out for you here, of Mark's Gospel says, the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And the life of Jesus as the Christ, as the Son of God, really only makes sense when you look back at it through the eyes of someone who had experienced Calvary and had also experienced the resurrection. That's what gives meaning to it. It's in looking back that Mark can find the sense of who Jesus was, even though he was rejected. So, faith. What does the gospel mean to you and your faith journey? Faith is an invitation to you, to me, to read your life and to tell your story through the lens of the cross and the resurrection. So can I suggest two questions to you to think about and to pray about with St. Mark's Gospel for next week? If you were asked to, could you sum up the good news about Jesus Christ, which is how Mark begins his gospel? Could you sum up the good news about Jesus Christ in 2 or 3 sentences? Because if you can't, if you're not working at that, you haven't really understood the whole purpose of who Jesus was. And then once you've summed up the message of Jesus and who Jesus was and the meaning of his death and resurrection, how does that good news help you make sense of your life? We're walking towards Lent, through Lent to the cross and resurrection. Chew over those stories over the next few days. And may God go with you as you journey and pray. God bless.